thanks a lot, Catherine.
Thank
and
you,
congratulations. Our second speaker is then the Sir Geoffrey Jellicoe Award winner from 2018. She was not able to attend in Singapore, where he was last year, so we have double luck to have her here today. And Anne Whiston-Spirn is a Cecil and Ida Green Distinguished Professor of Landscape Architecture and Planning at the MIT Institute. She's an American landscape architect, photographer, and author. Anne studied art history at Radcliffe College before she received her master's degree in landscape architecture from University of Pennsylvania. She started to work as an ecological designer, a planner, and her work promotes community-oriented spaces that are functional, sustainable, meaningful, and artful. And later, she has also been working with projects that links landscape design, community development, and urban stormwater management together. Her strong ability in communicating knowledge and discoveries is for all to read in her fantastic and important books, starting in 1984 with The Granite Garden, Urban Nature and Human Design, is really worth revisiting and reading if you haven't read it before. And her latest book from 2014, The Eye is a Door, Landscape Photography and the Art of Discovery, is a beautiful lesson for us all to rediscover and reflect on what it is to see. We are humbled and very humbled about her achievements, and we are excited that she is our special guest as the winner, and honored that she will be here and give her lecture. So her title, Anne's title, is Reflections on 50 Years in Landscape Architecture. Please welcome Anne.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. So, Sir Geoffrey Jellicoe was a giant as a designer, as a thinker, and author. His work has been an inspiration for me. As a matter of fact, I've collected his books. I think I have all of them. As it must be for all landscape architects, it is fitting that IFLA's highest award bears his name, and I am so honored to receive it. What I want to do in the next few minutes is to share with you some reflections on my own experience in broadening the appreciation for our wonderful profession, in pointing to its accomplishments and promise, in expanding the scope of its theory and practice. For me, practice and theory are completely linked. All my books have grown out of the practice of landscape architecture and the reflection on its history. I want to expand and enrich the practice and theory of our profession from within, but I also want to increase the understanding and respect for our work among others, because landscape architecture has a vital and essential role to play in addressing the world's most pressing problems. That's becoming a refrain that we're hearing today, isn't it? Human survival depends upon adapting ourselves and our landscapes, cities, buildings, gardens, rivers and fields, and forests in new life-sustaining ways, on shaping places that reflect the interconnections of air, earth, water, life, and culture, that help us feel and understand these connections. Landscapes that are functional, sustainable, meaningful, and artful. My career as landscape architect, teacher, author, and photographer has been dedicated to advancing this goal. I once thought that the obstacle to achieving that goal was lack of knowledge, and I wrote my first book, The Granite Garden, to fill that void. The book presents, synthesizes, and applies knowledge from many disciplines to prove that cities are part of the natural world, to show how they are shaped by natural processes, and to demonstrate how they can be planned in design in concert with natural processes. Organized by sections on air, earth, water, life, and ecosystems, the book describes successful cases from the scale of house and garden to the scale of city and region. The Granite Garden was well received when it was published in 1984, and it gained a broad general readership. But where's the art? Was the response of some landscape architects. Their question perplexed me because aesthetics was a driving force behind the book. But in the 1980s, there was a deep divide among landscape architects between those who advocated ecological design and those who promoted landscape as art. To heal this divide, I edited a special issue of Landscape Journal in 1988 on nature, form, and meaning, and wrote The Poetics of City and Nature. This essay was a manifesto for a new aesthetic for urban design that would celebrate natural processes and make them more visible and tangible, that would fuse function, feeling, and meaning. Poetics also urged designers to reclaim urban infrastructure as a domain of landscape architecture, and we have done that in the last 30 years. I was frustrated by another response to the Granite Garden. Many people, including landscape architects, told me, I can see how your ideas apply to the design of new towns, but what about existing cities? They're already built. I started the West Philadelphia Landscape Project in 1987 to provide answers to these questions, to explore how to restore environmental quality and rebuild low-income communities in existing cities. By then, I was teaching at the University of Pennsylvania, and I developed an academic practice where my teaching salary, along with grants from foundations and public agencies, supported a series of design and planning experiments. I studied vacant land as a potential resource and discovered a striking correlation in low-income inner-city neighborhoods between abandoned land and valley bottoms, the former floodplains of buried streams. The Mill Creek in West Philadelphia, for example, once drained 2/3 of that district. In the 1880s, it was buried in a sewer, its floodplain filled in and built on, but it still drains the stormwater and carries all the wastes from over half of West Philadelphia. During the 20th century, the buried creek undermined buildings and streets. In wealthy neighborhoods, the land was rebuilt, but in poor neighborhoods, it often remained vacant. Burying the stream in a sewer created another problem, combined sewer overflows. After major rainstorms, the flow in the sewer exceeds the capacity of the sewage treatment plant, and so the combined stormwater and sanitary sewage overflows into the river. In the 1980s and 90s, there were few funds to build low-income neighborhoods, which had suffered disinvestment for many years. And here you're looking at vintage GIS map from 1989. But there was money for cleaning up water pollution from combined sewer overflows. One approach was to build huge underground tunnels to store the combined sewage, and that's what the city of Chicago actually did. But why not address the problem with a cheaper solution? Prevent stormwater from entering the sewer in the first place by capturing it in green infrastructure projects on low-lying vacant land that would be public parks. Now, green infrastructure was a well-accepted idea by the 1880s when I first made this proposal. The only new things about my proposal were to apply this approach to preventing combined sewer overflows as opposed to preventing floods, to recognize the resource represented by vacant land on these buried floodplains, and to use funds for improving water quality to rebuild inner-city neighborhoods. Since 1987, this proposal has been a key part of the West Philadelphia Landscape Project. In the 1980s and early 1990s, I shared our database and proposals with public officials. I hope to convince the city of Philadelphia to adopt these proposals. But when the city's plan for West Philadelphia was published in 1994, it said nothing about restoring the natural environment, and it failed to mention the buried floodplain and the problems it posed. That year, subsidized housing for new low-income homeowners was built on the buried floodplain of Mill Creek. So what do you do? Confronted with skepticism about the existence and hazards of the buried floodplain, I began to understand this resistance as a form of illiteracy, an inability on the part of public officials and even the residents themselves to read the signs of ongoing natural processes in the urban landscape. So I organized my teaching and research to address this kind of illiteracy. My students and research assistants analyzed the urban watershed, demonstrated how stormwater could be collected in landscape projects, and produced designs to illustrate what such stormwater detention projects would look like, how they might be implemented, how they would work. When the West Philadelphia Landscape Project website was launched in early 1996, it featured the database reports and design experiments. It has been a showcase for ongoing work ever since. To reach the larger community, I launched a program on landscape literacy and community development in a public school next to the Mill Creek's buried floodplain. From 1996 to 2001, hundreds of children at Sulzberger Middle School learned to read their landscape. They traced its past, deciphered its stories, and told their own stories about its future, some of which were built. And their ideas were posted on the West Philadelphia Landscape Project website. And if you're interested, you can see the www.wplp.net is the address of that website. Studying their neighborhood's natural and built features brought the place alive for these 12 to 13-year-olds. An understanding of their own landscape also opened wider vistas. It introduced them to broader social, political, and environmental issues and promoted other learning. And it introduced them to landscape architecture. 20 years ago, I thought that the worst effect of landscape illiteracy was to produce environmental injustice in the form of physical hazards to health and safety. The middle school students showed me that there is an even greater injustice: the internalization of shame for their neighborhood. Without an understanding of how the neighborhood came to be, many children believed that the poor conditions were the fault of those who lived there. Once they had knowledge and skill to read the landscape's history, they began to see their home and themselves in a more positive light. They came to consider the possibility of alternative futures and had so many ideas. To read and shape landscape is to learn and teach, to know the world, to express ideas, to influence others. Finally, by the late 1990s, the idea of using green infrastructure to eliminate combined sewer overflows was taken up by the Philadelphia Water Department, which produced Green City Clean Waters, a landmark plan which was adopted by Philadelphia in 2009. The West Philadelphia Landscape Project also served as a laboratory for my second book, The Language of Landscape, which argues that landscape is a form of language, and that in shaping landscape, we humans express purpose, values, and ideas. This language underlies the great works in Jeffrey and Susan Jellicoe's classic book, The Landscape of Man, and it underlies ordinary, everyday landscapes also. The book calls for a change in the way we shape our environment. Its goal is to help people read the environmental, social, economic, and political stories embodied in their local landscape, and to inspire them to envision new stories and new landscapes. Its goal is to also help landscape architects express ourselves more fluently and more eloquently through the places we create. The language of landscape is the principal language in which I think and act. It is also the language used so skillfully by designers whose work I most admire. Designers like Frederick Law Olmsted, Sigurd Leverance, and Jeffrey Jellicoe. The work of great designers was a library for me in exploring and defining the language of landscape. I used photography to explore the elements of landscape language across different types of landscape and to compare landscape metaphors and polemics across cultures. Photography brought ideas into focus. While all my work aims to develop the ability to observe landscapes more deeply and critically, That's the principal focus of daring to look and the eye as a door. Seeing is, for me, a way of knowing, and photography a way of thinking. The eye as a door invites the reader to join in this process of seeing, thinking, and discovery. In many ways, the eye as a door is a sequel to the language of landscape. The photographs here, individually and in pairs and sequences, present many of that book's arguments and ideas. Landscapes are a vast library of literature. The works in that library range from wild and vernacular landscapes, tales shaped by everyday phenomena, to classic landscapes of artful expression, like the relationship of ordinary spoken language to great works of literature. But the landscapes in this library cannot be gathered in a single place, and no one person can hope to read them all. Fortunately, we now have the tools to visit the works of that library virtually. The great potential that multimedia and the web afford for the portrayal of place in space and time, and as an interplay between ideas and form, has barely been tapped. Marna's A Journey in Space, Time, and Ideas extends my exploration of photography, multimedia, and website design as media of inquiry and expression. Marna's is the garden laboratory of the master designer-theorist, Sven Ingvar Andersen, who documented his experiments there through thousands of photographs taken over the course of 50 years. And by the way, I noticed that there's an issue of Landscape magazine, the Scandinavian Landscape Architecture magazine, that's available to be picked up. And in it is an article that I wrote about Marna's garden and the Marna's project. It's in English. This incredible documentation made possible an interactive website designed as an immersive 3- and 4-dimensional experience. Now you can journey through the garden in space and time. You can walk down leafy tunnels through diverse spaces and travel across time in successive views of the same space across decades. On the self-guided tour, you encounter short multimedia videos where Andersen's own words reveal his thinking. You can also take a guided tour with Andersen as guide, hear his stories, watch the garden change through seasons and years, follow the ideas that drive the form. You can watch the film on a big screen, or you can view it on your smartphone. I've been experimenting with multimedia video since 2012, when I first went back to interview people who had been engaged with the West Philadelphia Landscape Project over the past 30 years. Their stories are captured in short videos. 3 teachers tell how our program on landscape literacy transformed their students and their school. One of these students reflects on how the program changed her life. A community activist recounts the impact of our partnership. Former research assistants tell how their work on the project shaped their careers and the work they do now. You can also hear my own proposals for the Buried River and the Water Commissioner's story of how Philadelphia developed Green City Clean Waters, the city's landmark proposal for reducing combined sewer overflows through green infrastructure. You can watch all these videos and more on the West Philadelphia Landscape Project website. I hope you will also visit my personal website, annwhistonspirn.com. I've posted my publications there, and you can download them for free, because at least all of those that I own the rights to, which is all but about 2. Unfortunately, you can't download my books. That's not allowed. You can also sorry, I lost my place. The publications include articles and professional reports and research monographs since 1973. You can also hear interviews and see photographs, and you can visit my classes. The World Wide Web transformed the way I teach, Since 1996, my course websites have been a framework for learning and a public forum for presentation and discussion. Students post all their work online so that others can see and discuss their findings. The work of each year's class is archived online, which means that current students learn from past students too. The archived websites date back to the earliest ones from 1996 to 99 at the University of Pennsylvania, and so all of the studio work from back at that time can still be seen on the website. The website for each course features the syllabus, including a reading list and descriptions of assignments and showcases for student work. These are public websites requiring no password, so anyone is welcome to visit. My classes at MIT have had over 60,000 online visitors. I hope that you will come too. And I hope that our meeting here in Oslo may mark the beginning of a longer dialogue. And now what I'd like to do is to invite you to my home in Boston, into my studio, and into my work with my partners in West Philadelphia. We have a short video that I made a couple of years ago for the National Design Award. But I think it also demonstrates this medium of the video and how much can be gotten across in a very short time. So this is very compressed, 3 minutes, covering much the same things that I've been speaking about here, but you'll see me in action. Video? One day I was on my way to the supermarket, and I looked down and there was this enormous hole. And I saw a big brown rushing river. The street had caved in. The cave-in, my first year in graduate school, was like a sign that if we don't get a better handle on how natural processes operate in cities and adapt cities to them, we're in trouble. And not just small trouble, but potentially catastrophic trouble. And it just piqued my curiosity. You know what? Buried rivers, invisible forces. How do you learn how to see them? You can't just keep opening up the street, you know? So how do you learn to see the signs? It's really like being a detective. You know, you look for clues, you look for pattern. Then you try to imagine what are the kinds of actions that might have caused that pattern. Then I think about how we could better adapt to these natural processes through design. For me, ideas come from these kinds of observations in real places. They also come from conversations with people, in dialogue with other minds, and from the act of design. For me, design is a form of research. I've been working in West Philadelphia for the past 30 years, and it's been a laboratory for me. It's a continual process of making a design proposal, trying to get it implemented, seeing whether it succeeds or fails, learning from that success or failure, and how can I build this experience into a larger theory to restore the natural environment and rebuild community at the same time. I write because I want to change the way people design and build the world. So I do write for designers and planners. I do write for scholars. But I also write for everyone else that influences the way things are done. Since I want to reach as many people as possible, I also have to go beyond the book. Helping people to see more deeply isn't only to see cities as part of the natural world or landscapes as a product of design, it's also to help people see and understand the things that most interest them so that they can think for themselves. If we're going to address issues like climate change, people have to be able to make up their own minds. I want to help people see, to make what may be invisible to them now visible, and through seeing to affect change in the world. Thank you for the honor of the Sir Geoffrey Jellicoe Award. So I hope that was a demonstration of how much you can get across in a very short video as opposed to a much more static kind of PowerPoint presentation.
And it really opens up for questions again.
Yeah.
And I'm really happy that you invited for dialogue. Both you said you invite everybody to your home. That's pretty fantastic. We see how many of the 1,400 will come on the door.
I did that in China once, and they came. Really?
Good. So please, if there is any questions, again, there is really the opportunity to actually ask Anne some direct questions on stage. There's so many things we can discuss, and I think, your background as a photographer and landscape architecture and the way of seeing is really so crucial. And landscape as language, you both touch up on seeing, writing, and then displaying. Right. So it's all fitting so well together. So any hands? We have the students run around with the microphones.
Oh no, I didn't silence you all.
Yeah, that's they're all, yes,
okay.
We have a hand over here, perfect. So please, can you stand up when you, because I know they also want to get you when they're filming. So please.
Thank you for a great presentation and also very inspiring and exciting us to move forward and change. I just noticed that you were talking about a challenge for you to convince maybe the public institutions to actually work on ground and change the infrastructure and make it more into a landscape ecological way. Can you tell us more about these challenges and how you actually overcame it, or you were able to convince them to go this direction?
Yes, I view it as my responsibility as an academic. I have the privilege of having my salary paid to teach, which is a delight. It's basically a license for lifelong learning. And I decided when I started teaching, I had 5 years in practice, and then so I know what it is to be in professional practice. I worked for 5 years in Ian McHarg's office. Ian McHarg, of course, is the author of Design with Nature. And I saw the power of a book, that even in the early 1970s, during a steep recession in the United States, the oil embargo, for those of you who are old enough to remember, and over half of architects in the United States were out of work, McHarg still had work coming in. And it was the power of the thing that was bringing the clients in was the book he'd written, Design with Nature. So when I set about to write The Granite Garden, I wasn't sure that I was going to, I wrote it at first to create a clientele for the kind of work I wanted to do, for which there wasn't yet a demand. And it worked. After the book came out, I got phone calls. I was teaching at the Harvard Graduate School of Design at the time as an assistant professor, and I started getting calls saying, okay, so do you have an office also? And I had to make a decision about whether to stay in academia or to set up a practice. I looked around me, and I couldn't find anybody who had a practice, was teaching, and also writing, who wasn't divorced. Really, seriously. And so I had a 4-year-old son and my husband, and I loved them, and I certainly didn't want to get divorced. And so what I decided to do was to continue to practice, but as an academic, and to use my academic salary to take on the kinds of projects that were not yet, that professional offices could not yet get as a job, because they weren't, there wasn't a demand for them yet. And so I started this work on vacant land and then ultimately water. But it took, like, from the first time I made the proposal, 1985, about combined sewer overflows, the Philadelphia Water Department didn't announce its landmark plan, which is going to convert over about 25% of the paved impervious surfaces in the city to sponge. That was 2009. You know, think about that how long a time it took. So I used my studios to demonstrate, and when the World Wide Web came out, in 1996, that first studio that was on the web, I was thinking for the audience, not just the students in the studio, but those water department engineers. I wanted to demonstrate through 30 students different work on, that really were engineered, because we linked in their course in construction design into the studios, so that they had to do all the grading for the work to show how you could actually take water off of streets and bring it to a vacant lot that could then become a wetland water garden, an outdoor classroom for this school. And it made it finally, through just persisting on this and writing about it and talking about it, in 1999, I finally got a call from the Philadelphia Water Department saying, would you take us on a field trip to the Mill Creek, this place you're always talking about, and show us what you've been talking about. And so we took a trip, and I gave them historical maps showing where the old stream was, and they went out, they saw the vacant land, they saw the sloping slope. Oh yes, water flows downhill. We can capture it here on this vacant land. And then we went out for a beer. And we spent about a couple of hours having beers and talking about what they could do. And at the end of that, we decided that they decided they were going to go after a grant proposal from the Environmental Protection Agency to do a demonstration project in this neighborhood. And they got it. And 10 years later, they announced this much larger plan. So it's, but in between there, I kept coming up against failure. And in a professional office, you don't have the time to just do all these speculative projects, right? I mean, you can take on competitions, but then there's a hope at the end of a competition you might actually win the competition and get the job. But in this case, it took too long, for a professional office to be doing this. But we who are in academia can afford to do this kind of work. I can afford to stay in the same neighborhood for 30 plus years, building relationships, not only with the people in the neighborhood, but also building relationships with people in public agencies. And ultimately, hopefully things happen. So I like to challenge landscape architects, those of you who are in academia, to take on your own values and find places to work that can expand the scope of our profession. Because the scope of our profession is potentially almost boundless, given the issues facing the world today. And but the problem with professional practice is you're dependent on somebody to pay you to do a job, because you've got an office with people that you've got to support. And unless you're very wealthy, privately wealthy, there's no way you can do that. But we academics can literally expand the scope of the profession. We can also celebrate the profession. And I write all of my books for a general audience. So my audience is from journalists, is politicians, is policymakers, not just landscape architects and urban designers, but really to try to get them to see the world differently and act differently and see the possibilities. I hope that answered your question. It was kind of a long answer. Sorry.
I think that was an excellent feedback, and I think it was really good that you're challenging a lot of the academics, which also then the students that are here should say, come on, teachers, we want to challenge you, because I think this is all about the dialogue between the different people. And I also think the way you then combine both, that you're actually at grade, common space, and really at earth, and at the same time actually have the opportunity to write academic articles is fantastic, and to share the books with us.
But I like to say, I don't have a PhD. I like to say that my PhD is 5 years in practice, because it fundamentally influences the kind of research I do.
I think that's an applause. And I thank you again, Anne. Thanks a lot. We move on to our next speaker.